Professor Hill, you touched on the question of European integration in your talk. How much of a threat do you think populist parties are to the notion of ever closer union?
I think the populist parties of the right are quite a considerable threat to it. If they stay at their present level of support or grow, then they are by definition, most of them, opposed to further European integration and indeed want to reclaim sovereignty, as they say, in a way that the supporters of Brexit in the UK have successfully so far done. The populist parties of the left are a different matter. Syriza and Podemos have shown more belief in the European project, and if they were in a stronger political position within their own countries than they are now, might well be supporters of the development of integrationist policies. Clearly, the Greeks, whether Syriza or not, believe in the euro. They want to be in the euro. They just want Greece's particular problem to be resolved and them to be relieved of the debt burden so that they can get the benefits of the euro. So in that sense, they don't have the sovereignty hang-up which the right-wing parties have.
In the questions and the talk itself, the idea of migration and migration's effect on populism and populist parties came up quite frequently. You touched on the idea of a romantic ideal of a state that this threatens. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yes. After 1945, most of Europe was in a very bad way, physically and materially, and peoples in most countries had families who had either lost members or friends, neighbours and so on. So there was a sense of a desperate need to recover. Through the help of Marshall Aid from the United States, through the European integration project itself, the European economies did recover remarkably quickly, as well as through the efforts of the countries themselves. In Britain, the Labour Party introduced the National Health Service, nationalised things which gave certain areas which gave confidence to the people who had voted for it in the first place. Not in Germany, of course. The ruins of that country were dramatically restored through the Wirtschaftswunder. So at that point, the peoples of those countries felt that they'd put the war behind them, they'd lost things, but they'd created the good life for themselves, looking towards the United States where that had happened perhaps 10 years before. Then, with the coming of various economic difficulties, that degree of disillusion turned out to be very damaging. The feeling in some extremist circles that our country has been taken away from us, that it's been handed over to foreigners, that we have not been asked about the changes that have taken place in our ways of life. And this is not necessarily all about poor migrants coming and taking jobs at very low pay. It's also about the fact that many of the jobs at very high levels have often gone to foreigners. I mean, in Britain, the governor of the Bank of England is a Canadian. But when things get hard, it gives an immediate excuse to think that life was better 20 or 30 years ago and that the elites have changed it and they benefit, but they haven't thought about the effects on us.
Jeremy Corbyn has recently been re-elected as the leader of the British Labour Party with an overwhelming majority. To what extent do you think that he is an example of a possible populist leader, and what do you think the impact of him will be on the future of the Labour Party and British politics?
On the face of things, Corbyn is not a populist because he has inherited one of the two great parties of British politics, which is very much engaged in the standard procedures of British parliamentary life and social life indeed, so that he doesn't need to go on the streets to whip up support against an elite. On the other hand, Corbyn himself has always been on the margins of the Labour Party. He's been a dissenter, so he's been on the margins of British politics, whereas the Labour Party leadership on the whole has, if anything, been more pro-NATO sometimes than the Conservative Party. And Corbyn has also been rather distant from the idea of European cooperation, whereas in the years since Kinnock led the Labour Party, it has been rather a pro-European party. What is more, Corbyn appears to be less interested in parliamentary politics, which he regards as old-fashioned, ceremonial, dominated by elites, and more interested in building a movement, which he's very successfully done by expanding the membership of the Labour Party, taking in more young people using social media and so on. And he's accused by some of his critics of not being bothered particularly about even winning an election, because he's more interested in putting pressure on government from the streets. If that is true, that is a pretty double-edged tactic, because it could destroy the Labour Party itself, and it could have very serious consequences for parliamentary democracy in the UK as a whole.